days ago, we woke up to another tragic aircraft collision on the ground, this time with an Air Canada flight colliding into a fire truck while landing. Do ground accidents like this happen a lot? Should we be worried? What do we know about it? Why do they happen? And what can we do to reduce them in the future? That and more on Aviation Intrigue.
The recent crash at LaGuardia is still under investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board and will be for quite a while. But according to preliminary reports, there were several factors at play here. But at a busy airport like this, something like a vehicle wanting to cross a runway would take a special clearance, just like any aircraft wanting to cross a runway. Unfortunately, the fire truck, which was heading to another incident at the airport, might not have heard the instructions and raced across the runway, unfortunately, at a very bad time when the aircraft was landing.
They were focused on getting to this other United Airlines that needed emergency services while disabled and facing a situation by themselves. Did the controller make a mistake? Did the landing pilots make a mistake? Is it a combination of all those things? There's so many factors involved here.
A lot of what's going to appear in the investigation is the use of technology. Now, at really busy airports like this, like LaGuardia and many other places that have busy airline service, they do have ground transponders, and that allows air traffic controllers to see digitally aircraft and sometimes vehicles on the ground. In this case, the reports say that the fire truck did not have such a ground transponder, but the question is, would that have helped?
We have heard from ATC recordings that the controller at the last minute tried desperately to tell the fire truck to stop because he knew there was a aircraft landing on the crossing runway. Why did the fire truck not stop? Did they not hear it? Was that communication jammed? Did they misunderstand it? There's so many unanswered questions that it's going to take days, weeks, if not months, before everything unravels into some coherent story here.
And from the standpoint of the cockpit of the airliner that was landing on the runway, just as the fire truck was crossing, there could have been a gap in communication that could not have been prevented because there are separate frequencies and separate controllers instructing vehicles and aircraft on the ground versus aircraft in the air. So it's possible that that aircraft was landing in touch with the control tower that had directed and cleared them to land. And so it would have been only visual cues, visual spotting that truck crossing the runway that could have prevented the collision, but it may have been too late. And that is a big human factor that will also be investigated.
In controlled environments, when there's a control tower telling you to do something, it is not unusual for pilots to listen to the controller and do what they've been told. Even then, a visual scan of the airport and the runway environment, if possible, if the weather allows, is necessary. Perhaps in this case, that's not what happened. We don't know just yet.
It's unfortunate that this collision could not have been avoided. In previous episodes, we have discussed close calls where jetliners have gone around, in other words, aborted the landing while they were still in the air, added full power, and climbed back out because they did see an interference with the runway with another aircraft or vehicle. These go-arounds happen all the time in the name of safety. Pilots are trained to do that. And in this case, unfortunately, that did not occur. I'm guessing it's because the pilots did not see the truck until it was too late.
Unfortunately, this is not the only time, and there's many in the history of aviation with accidents and incidents similar to this. When we come back, we'll talk about that, but more importantly, to try to understand why this happened and what can we do as an aviation community to reduce and minimize the impact of runway incursions, which is the terminology that we use in aviation. These runway incursions, how common are those? How many of those happen in a given year? We have some statistics coming up later on. But first, let's talk about what a runway incursion is. It is when an aircraft is in a wrong position at the wrong time when somebody else is either landing or taking off, putting both at a danger.
That's the FAA definition, and that does include aircraft, vehicles, or persons, anything that could be incorrectly moving onto a runway. So, what does that really mean in real life? Sometimes we see instances of an aircraft waiting to enter a runway, thinking that an aircraft landing isn't there, and they roll out onto the runway to begin a takeoff. That is one example of a runway incursion. Another example would be a vehicle driving onto a runway, or even a person walking out onto a runway where an aircraft is present. And that aircraft could be taxiing, could be completing a landing rollout, preparing for takeoff, or coming in for landing. And that would also fit the definition of a runway incursion.
Most people think that the biggest airline accidents and incidents happen while the planes are in the air. But did you know that one of the worst that happened actually happened while two planes hit each other on the ground?
A lot of pilots have read the story about what's known as the Tenerife ground collision. This occurred in 1977 and to this day remains the deadliest aviation accident in the world. It occurred on a Spanish island off the coast of Spain called Tenerife. There were two Boeing 747 airliners, each operating for different airlines, that were at the airport. Weather was probably the most obvious factor. It was very, very foggy and the aircraft taxiing could not see each other. And unfortunately, that was the root cause of the collision. There were also some other factors with radio communications and definitely the ability to not be able to check for traffic on the ground. One of the airliners did begin a takeoff roll with the other 747 on that runway. And unfortunately, due to the fog, they did not see each other until the last second. The airliner taking off actually did attempt an early takeoff when they spotted this aircraft in an attempt to avoid them, but unfortunately, very, very low to the ground. Soon after taking off in a desperate attempt to avoid a collision, they did collide. Both aircraft caught on fire, and more than 500 people died in that crash.
In the United States, a similar incident happened in 1996 in Quincy, Illinois. A Beech 1900 aircraft was landing on a crossing runway when a King Air was setting up to take off from another runway, which was intersecting. Unfortunately, 14 crew and passengers lost their life. In this case, it was a non towered airport, which means that there was no control tower, which means that these two aircraft depended on communicating with each other and visually checking to make sure that the runways are clear.
So both of these incidents were a little bit different in that in Tenerife, the weather was very foggy and it would have been quite impossible for aircraft to see each other until they were very, very close proximity. In the Quincy incident, the weather was pretty clear and it was late in the day. And according to witness reports, the Beech 1900 had bright strobe lights and was visible several miles out as it was coming in for landing. But what's common between the two, despite the different conditions and different types of airports, was that there was miscommunication or misunderstanding in the radio communications. Regardless of whether it's air traffic controllers talking to the aircraft or pilots in the aircraft talking to each other, which will be a very common occurrence at non-towered airports, they are talking via radio communications and may not be in visual line of sight with each other. And so it can be very easy to not be aware that another aircraft might be in your way.
Whether in a controlled tower environment or in a non controlled, non towered environment, unfortunately, the human factor, the human element comes into play despite all the technologies and all the advancements that we have. If you look at the aviation statistics, approximately runway incursions happen about 100 every month or about 1,700 a year. And that has been pretty steady over the last decade or so. What can we do to avoid this? What can we do to learn from that? And how do we teach our new pilots? That coming up.
The FAA does track runway incursion reports very carefully with monthly and yearly statistics. Now, they do keep their statistics by their fiscal year, which run from October to October. Those statistics are still within 12 calendar months period. And if you look through the history, you will find that the 1700 incursions is a very common pattern year after year. Every month, there are well over 100 runway incursions, month after month after month. And despite better training, better technology, these still occur.
Unfortunately, though, these numbers are most likely underreported because in rural airports or non towered airports, runway incursions or near misses happen way more frequently than in big airports and probably never get reported. So the numbers we are talking about are only what are officially captured by the FAA and NTSB databases.
As we mentioned, the incidents where an actual collision with another aircraft or a vehicle occur is no longer counted as an incursion. So the incursions as reported are actually near misses, close calls, or minor incidents where there was no risk to safety. And that's why the FAA categorizes each runway incursion on a scale of A, B, C, or D, with A being the most serious close call incident where an accident was narrowly avoided, according to the FAA definition, up to D, where there was an incursion, but there was no risk to safety.
Why do this happen? Most common reason is a human error. Somebody did not do what they were supposed to do. But it could also be because they misheard something, missed a communication, misunderstood something, or simply did not check visually what was actually happening and were simply relying on data that was communicated to them by the control tower or by their flight computers. No matter what, somebody did not do what they were supposed to do and ended up in a situation that caused a runway incursion or worse yet.
A lot of these close calls or runway incursions do occur with a number of incidents leading up to the near miss. And that definitely includes the human errors. And we'll note that the majority of runway incursions reported are due to pilot error, followed by second place operational errors, including ATC, and in a distant third, other factors such as vehicles or people entering the runway. So, relying on verbal radio communications without visually checking is probably one of the biggest gaps that can lead to runway incursions. And so, in terms of human factors, cognitive bias, in terms of expecting what you hear on the radio to be true and not visually checking, is one thing. There are also other human factors can literally include your mind playing tricks on you. Maybe you visually check a taxiway or a runway and don't actually see something that is there. A lot of this is due to distractions in the cockpit, which is another top human factor that can lead to incidents and accidents. Pilots getting ready for takeoff, getting ready for landing, perhaps even visually checking the area, may be too busy to cognitively digest what is going on, and that can also lead to a close call. Combine that with misunderstanding or not hearing communications, and you are definitely set up for higher risk for a runway incursion.
So, what can we do as an aviation community, as flight instructors and student pilots to avoid this? That coming up.
So, if pilot error, due to all the human distractions going on in the cockpit, is the number one cause of close calls, runway incursions, and some of the accidents that have happened, what can we do to mitigate those risks?
As flight instructors, we try to get these human factors as part of our instruction. For example, when you are getting ready to take off or even depart the area, making sure that you're not only following all the checklists as you're supposed to, but also taking the time to avoid any distraction, checking if there's anybody in the air, not taking for granted that just because you have not heard them in the radio, that means that the area is clear. Visually inspecting the area is one of the simplest thing you can do, but a very effective thing you can do. For example, one thing that we do is just before you take off on the runway in a non-towered airport, we do a quick 360 in the airplane, making sure that visually the entire area is clear prior to we getting on the runway.
This visual check is something that needs to be ingrained in pilots as a good habit. The type of aircraft you're in, let's say a low wing where you don't have much visual obstruction of the sky above you, does make it a lot easier to check the traffic pattern for anybody inbound before you enter the runway. If you're in a high wing aircraft, that's a blind spot, and pilots are taught when they're flying a high wind aircraft to definitely make a full 360-degree turn so that they're able to inspect the entire traffic pattern above the airport. And so the type of aircraft is a big factor in terms of physically blocking the view of other traffic coming in. And by the way, when you enter the runway, we are also teaching pilots to visually inspect ahead to make sure that any aircraft holding short of the runway aren't starting to move while you are doing your takeoff roll, and making sure that vehicles and people and other objects are not in the way as well. And so taking the time, even just a few seconds for a double check, can get rid of other distractions and things that could prevent you from seeing traffic.
In some airports, it's not unusual for you to not be able to see the other end of the runway because of natural terrain slopes or other obstructions. And especially if there are crossing runways, you may not be able to see what traffic is taking off or landing on it. And also, did you know that in non towered airports, in the United States, you're not even required to have a radio. That means that there could be another aircraft that is operating in the area without any radio, and therefore they're not talking. That means that you're not listening. That means that you may not know unless you visually spot them.
Keeps going back to that visual check. We also teach pilots that even if you do have full radio communications with other aircraft, don't always expect that they're going to make a transmission at the right time because distractions could prevent them from doing so. We are taught as pilots to fly the airplane first, navigate to control your flight path, and then communicate. So, with that being often the last priority in terms of managing an aircraft in flight or on the ground, communications can be missed. And so we are taught not to depend on them 100%.
Now, maybe many of the pilots know that there's a little bit of a Wild West in some of the rural, non towered airports where maybe some of these rules are not really rules and people violate them, or at least they take advantage of it all the time. Does this happen to you? Have you ever witnessed situation where maybe somebody's on a takeoff roll before another aircraft has exited, or maybe you did not make the radio calls properly, or any number of things? If you're comfortable, do share those in the comment section below.
If you enjoyed this episode, please like and follow us and share your stories with us in the comments. We'd like to remind you that these episodes are not to take the place of actual flight instruction or regulatory advice. For more information, please consult with a certified flight instructor or the FAA.